This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 8, The Peddler. I was enjoying a precious slice of late afternoon shade delivered graciously by the giant banyan tree across the street from my front yard. Wiggling my bare toes in the cool grass while straddling my stingray, I heard him first, the distinctive burbling putt-putt sound I had come to know from watching scores of World War II movies. He slowly turned the corner all the way at the end of the street in a small black Jeep. This vehicle was an oddity at the time, at least in Miami, perhaps having something to do with the lack of air conditioning in the stripped-down military runabouts. It had no top, and I noticed a few kids in the back. He shifted a couple of times as the small bug of a vehicle bounced down the road towards me. I watched it carefully, having only seen them on TV. It rode rough, and the steering was abrupt as it skittered along and jittered from side to side. Nothing more than a mechanical conveyance, bare bones and to the point. He bumped to a stop right in front of me. The driver, a tall dark-haired man with a broad grin, greeted me with a hearty hello. I smiled tentatively and said, "Hi." If I could have guessed, I would have said his best buddy was Tarzan, and he'd just returned from an adventure with him somewhere deep in an African jungle. He was wearing a short-sleeved khaki shirt and shorts to match, and leather bush boots laced neatly all the way to the top eyelet. He had a deep brown tan. Sitting behind him in the little open military vehicle were Dinkle and Dork. They were attired in broad grins as well, obviously enjoying the open ride in the man's Jeep. Flashing his warm and engaging smile, he said he was giving rides to the neighborhood kids and asked if I wanted to jump in too. I dropped my bike in the grass, trotted over, and hopped into the back. He shifted the Jeep into gear and eased off down the road. Away we went, riding in the open back with a tropical breeze blowing in our faces. I could see why Dinkle and Dork were smiling. Riding in a Jeep was pure, clean fun. His name was Mr. Jones. He asked mine and where I lived, and I said, right where I dropped my bike, and my name is Keith. That was my front yard. He smiled some more. We rolled along through the neighborhood at about 20 miles an hour. At the corner, Lobster was standing at the edge of one of the last wooded building lots in our development. It would not be long before he would help a local builder clear it by accidentally setting it ablaze. Mr. Jones pulled over. Seeing us in the back, Lobster ran right over and jumped in too. As we motored down Rock Garden Lane, passing in front of Dork's house, Cricket was walking down his driveway. Mr. Jones hit the screechy brakes. We told Cricket to climb aboard. He crawled into the front seat. The little buggy was now jammed with 5 kids. He shifted into gear and eased out the clutch. I gave Dinkle and Dork a "what's up" look, and Dork just said this man had a camp. What that meant, I was not exactly sure. We continued to bump along down the road. With the Jeep now at capacity, and no more prospects in sight, Mr. Jones slowed and pulled up in front of Dinkle's house. He urged the gear shift into neutral and yanked up on the handbrake. It made a ratchety sound, and the 4-cylinder motor coughed to a stop. With his small and young audience now captive and focused, Mr. Jones began to weave his colorful tale. Way up north was a very special place, tucked deep in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. He had come all the way from that place, over 1,000 miles distant, to invite kids in our area that very summer to join him and his friendly staff in the cool mountains for several weeks of fishing, canoeing, hiking, crafts, horseback riding, golf, water skiing, square dancing, camping, lake swimming, and spelunking. I liked the sound of spelunking, whatever it was. He added that there were many more fun activities, too innumerable to mention. Further, he noted, youngsters who hadn't spent a summer atop Lookout Mountain were certainly lacking in youthful adventure and likely missing out on one of the great summer experiences of American life. He was the director of Camp Cloudmont, he announced, Our full attention was now well secured, our curiosity equally primed. He bent forward and, from under his seat, retrieved a small stack of colorful flyers detailing the grand camp experience that awaited only the luckiest of kids. There were even pictures of some of the activities he had described. He passed them around and instructed us to take them straight home and be sure to show them to our parents. Then he went for the clothes. He said our attendance was a must at the next summer session, and to give us a clearer picture of how wonderful a place this special camp really was, he would be back before too long for a movie night at one of our homes so we could all better visualize for ourselves the delights that awaited us in the murky and mysterious Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. We all clambered out of his Jeep, flyers in hand. While we stood grouped together in Dinkle's gravel car park below his house, we wondered what to make of this friendly fellow and his story of a glorious summer camp way up north in a state none of us had even driven through. Mr. Jones shifted into gear, hailed goodbye with gusto, and slowly motored away up the hill. Lobster wadded up his flyer and stuffed it in Dinkle's mailbox. Cricket followed suit. They both ran off up the street. The next week, word got around. There was going to be a movie night at Little Billy's house on Saturday. We were all invited. There would be popcorn and soft drinks, and Mr. Jones would be providing a special showing of movies from his exciting summer camp. It was an entertaining evening for sure. The movie was great, well crafted and colorful, as it wove a story in the most appealing detail about all of the wonderful activities and associated amenities that were available to lucky Cloudmont campers. Days and nights were jammed full of stimulating adventures. My favorite was the zip line that began high up on a perch in a tree. The rider would sail off in the air, heading in a high-speed descent right through the forest, bound for a smooth landing in the cool blue lake over 100 feet below. I also liked the canoes. Having never even been in one, I always had heard they were very tippy, but not a single kid overturned in the movie. The horseback riding along wooded mountain trails where Indians once rode 300 years earlier held me completely spellbound. I bet if one looked closely, there would be real flint arrowheads among the dirt and rocks. As the movie drew me in and spurred my imagination, I believed I might experience the same types of adventures as perhaps young Tom Sawyer did 100 years earlier, while he navigated the hills, woods, and even some caves on his journey down the Mississippi River. Mr. Jones was in his element, rolling through his well-polished monologue highlighting with seasoned eloquence the wonder and enchantment of America's premier summer camp. More than once, and at just the right moment, he would pause the film to take questions. There were many. How big were the fish? How many horses did they have? Was the lake water cold? Were there leeches? Would there be girls? Was the food good? Were there bears? What about mountain lions? I was a bit surprised that not a single parent had attended the movie night other than little Billy's. As the hosts, they had no choice. Mom had made an excuse and asked that we just get all the details so she and Dad could discuss the matter with the other parents at their leisure. The next week, a few phone calls were made, discussions were had, assessments concluded. The decision was prompt. Mr. Jones had done his job well. Lobster, Ding, Dork, Cricket, Dinkle, and I were off to Camp Cloudmont for the time of our lives atop a high mountain deep in the woods of Tennessee. Oddly, little Billy wasn't going, even though his mom hosted the movie night. If asked, McDonald's, Disney, and perhaps even Mr. Jones would probably dispute just who was the first to master and massively leverage the Happy Meal marketing concept. It's simple and goes like this. Lure the children in, and the parents, the ones with the money peeking out of their pockets, will follow. Regardless of who conceived the technique, I realized some 45 years later that Mr. Jones, the director, had certainly burnished it to a brilliant sheen. My mom went into a flurry of activity, assembling the required gear noted in great detail in the camp brochure. Large, lockable trunks were required to hold everything we would need for 6 weeks in the woods. We didn't have a single trunk, so my dad headed out to Sears to secure 3. They had to be filled with 8 matching sets of clothing to last between weekly laundry days. The extra set was to cover unexpected mishaps. Underwear, athletic socks, shorts, jeans, t-shirts, parkas, sweatshirts, sneakers, a belt, boots, toothbrushes, toothpaste, and soap, just to start. These were the basics noted on a long printed camper's list. Shame on the mother who scrimped. The older boys also needed deodorant and jock straps. The list of items seemed to go on and on. Everything had to be meticulously labeled so other campers would not mistake our stuff for theirs. I could only imagine that the pilferage of such items was a serious problem. My mom mail-ordered rolls of little labels with our names printed on them and sewed them one by one to the insides of each and every garment. It was madness, but she did it nonetheless. Today we use a Sharpie, done in 10 minutes. A large mob of kids assembled one Saturday afternoon in the sultry July heat at a nondescript high school parking lot somewhere in North Miami. I marveled at just how many neighborhoods Mr. Jones must have rumbled through in his black Jeep. He greeted us wearing his signature safari outfit, but this time sported a hat to match. Were we headed to Zimbabwe? I thought the brochure said Tennessee. Maybe there was no Camp Cloudmont at all, and instead, we were on our way straight to a steamer ship on an overseas voyage to African salt mines. It took a while to load up 50 or so kids in their trunks, with each containing at least 50 items. That added up to thousands of individual garments that parents had to assemble and label in preparation for the summer camp adventure. Retailers must have experienced a pronounced surge in business every time the director canvassed a neighborhood in his well-used black Jeep. The large white charter bus, loaded to capacity with excited campers and Mr. Jones, was soon cruising up the Florida Turnpike in the bright afternoon sun, with menacing cumulonimbus forming in the west. We had the angle on them and were moving too fast. The bus was cruising at 60 miles per hour, and the best a cumulonimbus could do was about 25. They'd never catch us. Following dinner at a McDonald's south of Jacksonville, there was the usual adolescent banter and a few shenanigans. We had the master on board, though, an experienced veteran of long chartered bus excursions with rowdy kids. Before long, Mr. Jones, dressed in his make-believe safari outfit, and now strangely holding a riding crop, provided a long and quite dry history of Cloudmont, encumbered with numerous family trees and perpetual hardship. As planned, this did the trick like a magic sleeping elixir. It grew dark somewhere near Waycross, Georgia, and everyone fell fast asleep. After rolling along all through the night, we stopped on a mountain parkway at a big diner for a hearty southern breakfast, just as dawn was bathing the mountain peaks in new light. Sadly, within a few days, I realized that this delightful and filling meal would be the best eating we'd have for several weeks. The weary and hungry campers spilled out of the big bus and stumbled into the place, filling the booths and overtaking the long line of vinyl-covered counter stools. I noticed a few older couples quickly exiting as the Cloudmont campers rolled in. All the waitresses spoke with a funny southern drawl. We had scrambled eggs and bacon and biscuits with gravy and a very odd, goopy white substance called grits. One bite was enough for me. Unfortunately, I would engage with grits again. Soon I learned that this rather tasteless glop that many slathered with butter, salt, and pepper, and sometimes syrup, was a staple of the Cloudmont diet. So were prunes. I met prunes in a meaningful way for the second time in my life, the first evening at Camp Cloudmont, when a few were plopped into one of the small compartments of my plastic cafeteria tray. They were limp and a dull grayish color. I did not request them. They were just that day's fruit. Apple slices, southern peaches, pears, oranges, or melons were nowhere in sight. There were only prunes. I noticed large cans of them stacked against the wall in the back of the kitchen. I had seen prunes a few times before and found them to be just revolting. Wrinkly and pungent with a squishy, chewy consistency once one penetrated the skin-like outer casing. The fact that prunes and their juice were used to urge the digestive tract along in its unsavory operations further diminished their appeal. I didn't like the smell either, and once even vomited convulsively while trying to take the smallest nibble of one at the insistent urging of my mother. My camp counselor of 3 hours had a thing about prunes and their nutritional value. He also had a thing about power and his need to assert it, and thus set boundaries early on in the Cloudmont experience, so a group of 10-year-olds did not run amok and trample right over him. He was monitoring the eating habits of his 6 new cabin mates and noticed that my 3 prunes remained nested in their small compartment, virtually untouched. He urged us all to finish our meals and not to waste any food, as clearly many less advantaged young boys were starving at that very moment in far corners of the globe. I told him that I couldn't eat prunes. When he asked me why, I told him that they made me hurl. I found them repulsive. He replied that it was high time I learned to eat prunes, and would have to finish them before I left the table. My cabin mates were finishing theirs and began to get up to return their empty trays. There would soon be a large campfire, with the director leading songs and telling ghost stories. The pressure was on, the impasse set. I wasn't eating prunes, and my new counselor was not backing off. I sat and stared at 3 prunes. My stomach churned. He made it very clear again that I would have to eat the prunes before I left the table. We sat alone and looked at one another. He had enormous glasses, tons of freckles, and a red crew cut. My cabin mates were scrambling for seats around the campfire. Realizing he was dead serious and prunes stood between me and the huge bonfire, I made a bold attempt. Cutting one in half, I stabbed it with my fork and raised it to my mouth. The vile odor filled my nostrils. My counselor shifted backward on the bench and smirked. Again, he insisted that I eat my prunes. With a final aggressive attack, I shoved half a prune into my mouth, pinched my nose hard, and chewed quickly, attempting to swallow. My stomach would have nothing of it. I felt a rising tide in my throat and gagged. I gagged again. In one convulsive, involuntary motion, vomit erupted explosively from my mouth. It splashed all across both of our trays and right into my counselor's lap. Whatever I had eaten for dinner was now on full display. I dropped my tray, still holding 2.5 prunes, on the stainless steel return counter and trotted out to the campfire. It was just a couple of days into our Cloudmont experience when a muted grumbling began. A snide remark by one of our cabin mates at first, followed by another. Soon a chorus of complaints welled up. It seemed that the actual camping experience was proving to be somewhat less grand than what had been portrayed during movie night back at Little Billy's house in Miami. While the basic elements were intact, with a mountain, a lake, trails, bunk beds, a stable, and a craft center, they paled in comparison to what was suggested in the snappy color film so professionally narrated by the director. Consider horseback riding. Far from a full, bustling stable of healthy and eager steeds ready to head out, I could only find 2 horses, an ancient and decrepit mare, clearly out to pasture, just praying for the end, and a crazed colt wearing a mean sneer that needed to be broken before anyone could possibly hope to saddle him up. Believe it or not, one of the activities for the young campers was to try to do just that. I signed up for horseback riding and ended up navigating a harrowing afternoon completely alone, chasing a bucking young bronco around a muddy corral with a heavy saddle in hand, making ridiculous attempts to throw it onto his back. In the end, he finally got tired and stopped, and I petted his nose a couple of times before he started to buck and kick again. In disgust, I dropped the saddle in the mud, jumped the fence, and headed back to my cabin. One afternoon, as we headed down to the muddy brown lake, somehow bright blue in the film, I asked my counselor when we could try out the zip line. He stopped, gave me a funny look, and asked me what zip line that might be. I said the one in Mr. Jones's movie. He groaned and rolled his eyes. The story was brief. Years earlier, some kid had fallen off of it and dislocated his pelvis. So the Cloudmont's legal counsel made Mr. Jones tear it down. The counselor pointed out that they always had a heck of a time getting the director to update his movie to more accurately reflect the current state of affairs atop Lookout Mountain. There was also a water slide in the movie, with young boys flying down it as they laughed gaily and launched into the bright blue lake. The slide had been removed. It was apparently too dangerous because the float it was attached to was not anchored to the lake bottom. Go figure. Again, the lawyers prevailed at the expense of the young camper's pleasure. Spelunking. When I inquired about this mysterious activity, my counselor pointed out that it was just a fancy term for exploring caves. The mountain was peppered with them, he noted. Now, getting the hang of things, I jumped ahead and took a wild, speculative stab as to why not a single counselor had even whispered the term since our arrival. The lawyers sealed all the caves, I proffered. Bullseye. No spelunking either. Apparently, a small group of rowdy campers, one jumbo-sized, snuck out late one night and crept quietly along a trail to a nearby cave. All was fine until the well-proportioned boy got pinched between two sharp rocks 20 feet underground. No matter how hard they heaved and hoed, his cabin mates couldn't budge him. Before long, spotlights illuminated a mountain rescue crew wearing orange vests and wielding pickaxes and lots of rope as they swarmed the cave entrance. Before long, he was pulled free, covered in grease, with a little more than a few scratches, a bruised ego, and a renewed pledge to skip the second serving of double fudge cake. That night, another Cloudmont activity quietly expired. Then there was the food situation. They had us going 90 miles an hour all day long. We were growing young boys and perpetually hungry. I believe Lobster grew a full 9 inches that year. There was just not enough food on Lookout Mountain. We would queue up 3 times a day with our tan plastic cafeteria trays, and they would spoon out the most meager of portions. We would wolf them down in minutes, and that was it. Meal over. Out we would go, stomachs aching, as we dreamed about the next meal still hours away. There was some intermittent pleasure. The highlight of my day was in the late afternoon when, after a quiet period during which we were supposed to write letters to our parents, we were released to the cloud room, a snack bar of sorts. It had a ping-pong table. As part of the camp fee, we had a small per diem for snacks. This is where I discovered a candy bar I had never seen before, the Zero Bar. It was a tasty, chewy, nutty nougat covered with white chocolate. I was immediately smitten and dreamed from the moment I awoke each day of the glorious Zero Bar awaiting me in the cloud room. I wasn't quite sure when my snack fund would be depleted, and this concerned me. One creative activity that was maybe our favorite of all was not even in Mr. Jones's film, but it should have been. Next to our cabin, we would often find jumbo dragonflies. They were absolutely huge and didn't move too fast. We would chase after them and eventually succeed in catching one, hold it down, and tie a long piece of thread to its tail. We then had a miniature dog on a leash, only it flew. With 20 feet of thread procured from the craft center, we would walk about for hours, with our own private dragonfly in tow. Passing by another camper would always elicit a double take, as they tried to figure out how a piece of thread was standing 20 feet straight up in the air. We all soon met chiggers on top of Lookout Mountain, or perhaps they met our groins. The proper name is thrombiculid mite. I will stick with chiggers. According to Wikipedia, the larval mites feed on the skin cells of animals. The six-legged parasitic larva feeds on a large variety of creatures, including humans, rabbits, toads, box turtles, quail, and even some insects. After crawling onto their hosts, they inject digestive enzymes into the skin that break down skin cells. They do not actually bite, but instead form a hole in the skin called a stylostomy and chew up tiny parts of the inner skin, thus causing severe irritation and swelling. To read this today and now understand what those chiggers were actually doing down there while I tried to sleep has to be one of the more unsavory things I can envision. And why they seem to always prefer a certain very sensitive body part remains a mystery. Within a few days of summer camp fun, it began. At night, tucked into our bunks, lights out, we would all hear the rustling underneath the covers. As taps played its depressing melody, our fingers would be busy between our legs, scratching away at unseen, microscopic chiggers as they burrowed holes into our skin and injected their digestive enzymes. We scratched away as they did their best to dissolve us. When I discreetly inquired of my counselor one morning about this new condition, he explained casually that it was just part of the Cloudmont experience. The chiggers would magically disappear once the session ended in another few weeks. He further pointed out that there would be no lasting damage to the private parts. Partially reassured, we all itched and scratched away in our bunks each night, with the confidence that our camping pals, the chiggers, would graciously remain behind upon our departure. It was late. Taps had just played, and I was lying on my bunk, scratching away, while watching the embers of the bonfire that marked the centerpiece of our cabin area pop and sputter. All of our cabins were built in a circle around it. Across the way, on the other side, was the cabin for older boys. That's where Lobster, Ding, and Cricket were being held. Following our arrival at Cloudmont, there had been some adjustment issues with Lobster and his counselor. Let's just say they were not bonding well, and the concerns were grounded in Lobster's inability to interface effectively with authority figures, plus some anger management things. He also had a broken finger. His perpetually smashed pinky had been fractured yet again the day before our departure for Cloudmont. He was sent off with an aluminum splint and several rolls of white adhesive tape that came in the little round metal canisters that cleverly opened from the inside out. Mom had pointed out to Lobster that he would have to be responsible for changing the dressing every few days, as it would certainly become a nasty mess as he rambled around in the Tennessee woods. He agreed. Late that night, as I drifted off after taps, unbeknownst to me, a single camper was still up. Lobster sat in his tiny bunk across the way with his overhead light on well after lights out, rule violation number 1. He had forgotten to change the dressing on his broken pinky. As he worked away with the adhesive tape to bind his sorry-looking finger to the curved aluminum splint, his counselor growled at him. Lobster, very tired and quite weary after a long day of Cloudmont disappointments, was still not enough to eat, mumbled a couple of expletives under his breath. Rule violation number 2. The counselor erupted. He began to stomp around, flinging a multitude of threats. Lobster threw more insults in return, clearly mocking the puffed-up teenager's authority. In a moment, A late-night emergency call was made to the director. Awakened abruptly, he arrived at Cabin C, red-faced, in his pajamas. I had heard the shouting on the other side of the campfire and was now wide awake, with face pressed up against the screen window next to my bunk, trying to see exactly what was going on while I scratched my chigger zone. My cabin mates joined me. There was growling and yelling, and then I heard, to my complete shock, the F-bomb, flung not once, but again and again. Lobster had just incurred his third violation. Could that be my brother? I thought to myself. It sure did sound like him. Then there was absolute quiet for a few seconds. Blasting out through the cabin screen door, Lobster leapt off the porch and into the light of the fading campfire, with adhesive tape trailing off his crooked pinky and the director in hot pursuit. Around and around the campfire they ran, Lobster in his underwear and Mr. Jones in his pajamas, commanding him to stop at once. Lobster did not respond. After 3 laps, realizing that he could not shake his pursuer, Lobster abandoned the fruitless chase altogether and vaulted back into the cabin. Mr. Jones, wheezing and out of breath, ambled in after him and slammed the screen door. The show over, I considered the absurdity of it all and drifted off to sleep. In the days that followed, I understood that there were some calls home and some serious consultations between Lobster and a few professionals. But the incident faded away. He still roved around Camp Cloudmont with his pinky in a splint and his broken glasses set crookedly on his nose. I also had the sense that the adherence to and enforcement of some of the policies at Camp Cloudmont had somehow been relaxed, if only slightly. My counselor walked into the cabin one Sunday morning and said we needed to get ready to go camping. We all rustled up our gear and assembled in the open space next to the campfire pit. There were 12 of us from cabins A and B. He said we were headed on foot over several hills and a few miles to an old farmstead where we'd camp for the night. It would take a few hours to get there. The farm had been abandoned years earlier, and for good reason. Apparently, one of the family members had gone insane and, wielding a long-handled axe, methodically hacked the family of 6 into bloody chunks. We would camp in the slaughtered family's old barn. Before we turned in for the night, we would take a hike out to their neglected graveyard, buried in some woods on the same land. According to lore, though gravestones usually mark the remains of the deceased, the plots below this ground were empty, as most of the remnants of this sad family weren't worth burying. Off we went in unison, a long line of 10-year-old boys, somewhere in the mountains of Tennessee, on a nighttime journey that had the potential to make the hair stand up on the backs of our necks. We planned to bed down later on an abandoned farm where headless ghosts of a long-lost family roamed about in the night. I tried my best to muster enthusiasm for the affair, but in the end found it all a bit unnerving. We arrived at the old farmstead near sundown and quickly made camp in a small clearing in front of the decrepit barn. The counselor soon made a roaring fire, and we grilled weenies, ate moon pies, and drank Kool-Aid. As the sun dipped below a Tennessee ridge, Dinkle, Dork, and I sat high up in the loft, legs dangling out from the opening where they used to haul up the hay bales with a block and tackle. We licked our fingers and dipped them into little pouches of Swiss Miss hot chocolate and ate it like candy. We said little as we pondered the approaching nightfall and the psychopathic killer that once staggered around the very spot below us, bloody, long-handled axe in hand. Before long night settled in, all was black as pitch. Just a sliver of a moon would rise later that evening. Our 2 counselors gathered us up in front of the barn. They said it would be about 2 miles to the graveyard, and we needed to stay together. they made it quite clear that absolutely no one wanted to get lost in the area. There was one other point they had neglected to mention. The axe murderer had never been found. The authorities assumed that he had just wandered off into the deep woods and died, but they could not be certain. Out we headed along the dark trail, led by the light of the counselor's 2 flashlights. I must admit that I was already a nervous wreck, and yet had a long hike in the dark ahead of me. I would be required to visit an old graveyard to cap it all off. On edge, I kept bumping into Dinkle and Dork ahead of me on the trail. I couldn't get close enough to those around me as I repeatedly scanned the dark hills on either side. At one point, I was certain I heard a voice in the distance somewhere behind me. I paused just momentarily and turned to look back. The voice was barely discernible, an unintelligible muttering. As I peered back down the trail, I could see only an inky black. Turning around, I was startled at how, in but a few moments, the small tribe of campers had surged ahead and taken the only spot of light for miles around right along with them. I exploded into a full sprint to catch up. In what seemed like an eternity, the counselors leading the way slowed and with a whisper told us that we were now close to the old graveyard. We were silent as we hung on every word and strained our ears for any sound. Soon, they said we would be entering a small stand of woods where the graveyard would be waiting for us. We moved ahead, but at a much slower and measured pace. Whatever scant moon glow we'd had on the trail evaporated quickly as we entered the small forest. The dark quickly closed in around us. I was all over my cabin mates, positively terrified to be more than 1 inch away. I could hear everyone's breathing. It was otherwise deathly quiet. Within a few minutes, we found the gravestones. 2 flashlights illuminated one after the other as we worked our way through the past lives of a large Tennessee family, apparently hacked to death by a psychopathic killer who had never been found. As we peered at the headstones in the dim light, one of the counselors quickly raised his hand and urged us to be quiet. He had heard something. We all froze, staring at his illuminated face, and held our breaths, trying to hear what he had heard. Someone coughed, he said. He was certain of it. But there could not possibly be anyone else nearby, in so remote a place, so late in the night. My knees began to shake. Then, from but 5 feet away, it began, a deep, moaning wail that rose to become the most horrifying shriek I have possibly ever heard. I exploded off the ground and into the air, completely overwhelmed with terror, and my body left me and began shaking and quaking. I involuntarily emitted the longest, guttural, roaring scream imaginable. In a moment, a dozen cabin mates wailed in unison. I shook convulsively, powerless, as my overcharged nervous system finally snapped, and the animal in me burst forth. I bellowed and bellowed like a maimed beast, until a counselor finally grabbed me and pulled me to the ground. It was all right, he said. It was all a joke, just a plan crafted and finally honed over many years to terrify a bunch of young campers. They did it every session. The heart-stopping wail had come from another counselor hiding in the woods. There was no psychopathic axe murderer, no dismembered family members. These farmers grew soybeans and got overextended. The kids fled and opened a restaurant in New York City. The graveyard was just like hundreds all over the county. It was how they buried their kin in the mountains of Tennessee. A harried and exhausted group of young campers stumbled back down the trail to the barn where we would thankfully get to sleep for the night. We arrived bedraggled around midnight. I was so exhausted, I didn't even care if a real axe murderer actually did show up at that point. I'd have gladly given him my head. Perhaps the best day of the Cloudmont experience was the last, at least for the campers and the director. The long line of station wagons slowly rolled up the dirt road and into the large parking area in front of the cloud room. Parents waved and laughed, and there were many hugs all around. We were all skinnier and needed haircuts and a proper bath. We had chiggers. Trunks with half the original contents were dragged out through the dirt and shoved into open tailgates. We shook hands and said goodbye to the new friends we had made as we bid them all adieu. The director, the shameless promoter, was out and in command, fully attired in his safari outfit and working the crowd to secure a full session the next summer. We're their younger brothers, perhaps? We have a delightful sister camp for young girls, you know, Valley View Ranch. It's just one mountain over. As we pulled away, and Dad aimed the car for a 23-hour drive home, I peeled back the wrapper of a Zero Bar and took a healthy bite. My mom was the queen of cliches, and one of her favorites was, "Idle hands are the hands of the devil." In the next tale, you'll see why she might have been right. It's chapter 9, and it's called Idle Hands.